We'll begin our account of the Christian Bible in the year 100 AD. We'll assume that at this point, all 27 of the books that will eventually make up the Bible have already been written, with John finishing up his apocalypse while exiled on the island of Patmos. What is most interesting about this point in time is that Paul's various letters to the churches and individuals have already been compiled together, and very shortly afterwards will be considered and called scriptural texts. This on the surface would seem a remarkable feat, considering the distance between the cities and the primitive communication network. There was, however, one group of people who already had all the letters in one complete package: Paul and his associates. These would have been the only people who actually knew how many letters Paul wrote and how many letters he received. Within these letters are evidence for other letters not included among the group. Paul himself refers to letters for which we do not have any other evidence. Someone had to choose which letters to preserve and which to discard. The best candidate for this is Paul himself. But considering all the other things Paul had on his mind during his final year, it is likely that it was Paul's associates, assistants, and companions who actually did the work. In addition to editing which letters would encompass Paul's body of work, the letters themselves were edited. The question, which we cannot hope to know, is how much influence Paul himself had on this process, if any. What we do know is that by the end of the first century, there was a group of letters attributed to Paul that were already being accorded the status of Scripture on par with the Hebrew Bible. What we do not know is whether this group of letters consisted of all 14 letters that later Christians would attribute to Paul, or whether other letters were added to this group for theological purposes. By the early part of the 2nd century, not only were Paul's letters in circulation among the Christian communities, but so were one or more of the Gospels. What language these Gospels were originally composed in, whether they were composed individually or by copying and editing from existing Gospels and texts, is a question still being debated and likely never to be fully resolved. What we do know is that by 115 to 125, these Gospels were in Greek and circulating among Christian churches. Of course, there were plenty of other Gospels in circulation, as well as letters, apocalypses, and manuals for living. One of the mysteries is at what point did the bulk of these books and letters get assembled into what would be labeled the New Testament. There is growing evidence that this assembly occurred rather early in the 2nd century, and by the midpoint, the core books were already a settled issue. The remaining discussions, which would last a couple of centuries, was just about a few books, such as the inclusion of John's Apocalypse, the letter to the Hebrews, and the inclusion of either the Gospel or Apocalypse of Peter. At the same time, we start to see the Hebrew Scriptures getting added to the collection as one total unit. It is likely the Hebrew texts were bundled together as early as AD 150 in response to Marcion of Sinope, who was arguing that they had no place within Christianity. When the Christians did start including the Hebrew text, they did one thing of great significance. They demystified them. They stripped them of their sacred scroll format and coverings, got rid of any oral companionship, leaving just the text to be read by any Christian who chose to read them. They were in their book, labeled as old, giving them an inferior status to the New Testament. Once there was some semblance of a complete Bible, the dispersion began, followed quickly by translation. What is also occurring are changes. If one takes just the 8 earliest manuscripts and lays them side by side, there are more differences than similarities. By the beginning of the 5th century, Christianity is now the official religion of the Roman Empire, and the 2 most important branches of the Bible commence. In Rome, the Church commissions an official Latin translation, performed by one of the great scholars of the day, Jerome. And in Constantinople, the Greek or Byzantine copying tradition begins. Jerome did not use much of the old Latin translations that were popular in Rome at the time. He also did not like the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, preferring translations directly from the Hebrew. This would upset many in the church who felt it undermined their claim that the Septuagint was the superior source. Jerome remained firm, and the Vulgate, his version, was based largely on the Hebrew texts that were standardized by the Babylonian Jewish scholar Hillel in the 1st century before the Common Era. The Vulgate was actually not well received initially, but gradually became the official version of the Catholic Church, and remained so until the concept of official versions was dispensed with. Although it has undergone a number of revisions over the centuries, the Vulgate remains the standard bearer for Latin Bibles. In recent decades, Catholic translations into native languages have been based more on the original Greek versions than the Latin of the Vulgate. The Protestant Bible did not take the Vulgate as its starting point. Rather, it chose to begin with the Greek texts from the Byzantine copying tradition. Unlike all the other versions, the Byzantine was not a translation from Greek. It was in the original Greek, which is one of the reasons it was preferred. The process was undertaken in 1516 by one of the great minds of the Reformation period, the Catholic Desiderius Erasmus. Because of a printer deadline, Erasmus had only 9 months to complete the entire project and could only find 6 rather poor quality, incomplete manuscripts from the 12th to the 15th century, and none were considered among Byzantine's best. The final product contained literally thousands of typographical errors and thousands of textual errors that revisions have been correcting for nearly 500 years. Still, when laid next to the 16th century version of the Latin Vulgate, this new translation demonstrated how badly copied the old Vulgate had become. The Erasmus 1516 version would be the version used by Martin Luther to complete his German translation, and the version William Tyndale would use to create the first ever English translation. Erasmus would print 2 more editions, each cleaning up and fixing his errors made in haste. In 1550, Robert Stephanus Estienne, a Parisian printer, would take Erasmus' work, add 6 more Byzantine manuscript fragments to his base, and produce a version of the New Testament that would become the base for the Geneva Bible, the first Bible to split the text into verses, and the Bible the Pilgrims would take on the Mayflower to America. Theodore de Beza, a successor of John Calvin in Geneva, would print his version in 1565, which would be used as the foundation for the King James Bible. In 1624 and 1633, Abraham Elzevir would print his version from the same manuscripts used by Stephanus, and the introduction to it would give this whole series of Bibles their name, the text which all now receive, or Textus Receptus. This was the foundation for all Protestant Bibles until the translations of the 20th century. Oh, and the version of the Old Testament they would use? Not the Septuagint that had so vigorously been defended for centuries by Christians, but rather the Masoretic text, copied by Jews for 15 centuries from the Babylonian scriptures brought to Israel by Hillel at the end of the 1st century BCE.